Well, good morning to everyone. This is the Ethical Humanist Society. I'm Dan Kaplan. I'll be moderating our program today. If you have your cell phone, please turn it on mute or turn it off. And again, welcome. So what is ethical humanism and what do humanists believe? Well, I found a quote from Isaac Asimov, an author, appropriate because we have a speaker today who is an author. We humanists celebrate humanity. We want humanity to survive. We recognize that if the humanity does survive, it will only be through its own efforts. Never can we sit back and wait for miracles. Miracles don't happen. Sweat happens. Effort happens, thought happens. Sounds like he's a writer. And it is up to us humanists to help to expend our sweat, our effort, and our thought. Then there will be hope for the world. In service to our community, we conduct programs and bring in speakers to talk about current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences. So today, on the 160th anniversary in 1 week for the Battle of Gettysburg, we're going to go into history. Now, Lincoln has been a part of my life since I was really small. We lived in Park Forest, and when I was 5, we moved into the Lincolnwood section of Park Forest, where every street was named after a person or place in Lincoln's life. So I lived on Rutledge Street, which was for Anne Rutledge, his first love, who died at the age of 22. And since I was 5, I asked my father if Abraham Lincoln was the same as the Abraham in the Bible. It was very confusing to me. In college, my very first week in humanities class, we started reading Lincoln's second inaugural address and pondering through that. And on business trips to Springfield, I would go to the Lincoln Library, and I did a little bit of research and figured out that at age 38, Lincoln did something that he may never have done previously in his life before, and that was ride on a train. Now, think about that for a moment. You spend your life walking on foot, horseback, on a covered wagon, maybe a riverboat, and suddenly you're on land going at 20 miles an hour. That must have been pretty exciting for him. So when I learned that my neighbor, Michael Frutig, had written a book with John Tomig on Lincoln, I couldn't wait to read it. And their book, Lincoln in Chicago, tells 2 great stories about Lincoln growing up in Illinois and about how Chicago, then a growing, bustling, dynamic series, helped his career. Michael is a graduate of the University of Iowa with a degree in English. He's here today to tell the story about his journey with Lincoln and the trials of becoming a published author. And with that, let's give Michael a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Dan. I wonder if I can prop that up. Probably not. Oh, well. I thought I would start today with a poem. Some of you may know it. Hog butcher for the world, toolmaker, stacker of wheat, player with the railroads, and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. Now, some of you will know that that was written by Carl Sandburg, a Chicago poet. And the reason I started with Carl Sandburg is because the man is the definitive biographer of Abraham Lincoln. If you open up any Lincoln biography written in the last 80 years, you will find referenced in the back Carl Sandburg. For the majority of his life, Sandburg wrote and wrote and wrote and researched and delved and found the letters and memories and memoirs of the people around Abraham Lincoln. And then he collated that into great works, which everyone reads when they want to learn about Lincoln and write their own stories on Lincoln. Sandberg's exhaustive work in the story of Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the last great connection between this city and the most famous president we've ever had. His work in preserving that story is fascinating and has preserved and cultivated and shaped the legacy of Lincoln. The reason I bring this up is because history is as much about what happened as it is about what people think happened. And in shaping the legacy of Lincoln, Carl Sandburg has done one last service to him and to this city. Chicago played a very important role in Lincoln's life. Lincoln was a dark horse candidate for the troubled presidency of 1860. He was a one-time congressman, and that one term in Congress went very poorly. He was an opponent of the Mexican-American War, which was popular in the United States at the time. And he was run out pretty quickly from his work. He was experienced in state politics, but not very much in national politics, and did not know many movers and shakers. But he knew the right movers and shakers. And the people he knew were Chicago-based. People like Judd, Medill, Wentworth. These men, coming from disparate backgrounds, not born in Chicago, but came to Chicago like many, were the ones who put him into the White House through hard work and quite a lot of trickery and deceit. They were a group of people with no love for one another. They had personal, political rivalries with one another. But they were all friends with Abraham Lincoln. And it's not just these famous, important men who supported him, but the entire city. Whenever Abraham came to Chicago, in the later years of his life, when he was a famous lawyer and politician in the state, he was always asked to give a speech somewhere in the city. Not particularly, with a lot of advance, but often just thrown in to speak on some topic, be it at the Tremont House Hotel, where everyone came to talk and debate the issues of the day, or at Northwestern, where he delivered speeches to graduates. Chicago was a boom town, younger than Abraham Lincoln himself. The city was incorporated about 20 years after he was born, but its position on the lake and at the center of the nation's railroads and waterways meant it was a boom town, made for shipping materials across the nation and across the world. For back-to-back decades, Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world. Tens of thousands of people came to this city. And like the man on the street, the political class of the city believed in free soil politics. And they were looking for someone who they could trust to deliver those free soil politics to the White House. Chicago was in many ways more moderate than places like New York, where the Republican Party was far more abolitionist than it was in the Midwest. Both the city and the people of the city were looking for someone who could deliver a moderate vision to the White House. Many of the people who lived in, many of the political class, rather, had grown up, had been in Springfield for years and years, but moved to Chicago because they could see that this city was, one, a place to make a lot of money, but two, an important center in political thought and political action. Over the course of his life, Abraham Lincoln came to Chicago some 20 times. Not very much, not very often. His longest stay was only for a couple of weeks, and most of the time he came here, it was to work on legal cases. The railroad company would hire him to come here, various other works. None of it was ever for his political ambitions or to get his name out, really. He came here to make money like so many others. Chicago offered him a place where he could test the waters, however, for his political platform and for his, both publicly and privately. At the Tremont House Hotel, he could meet with men from Washington or across the prairie and talk with them about the issues of the day. He also interacted with the people and saw parades and gave speeches, as I have mentioned. And it was through this coming here and just talking and meeting and strengthening connections and becoming friends with the people of the city, that he was able to win the White House. The political class of the city wanted him to succeed. They wanted to push him forward. And so they set up opportunities for that. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were created by Joseph Medill in order to win the Senate race of 1858. This was done because he knew his man was a great speaker. And so, in engaging debates across the state, he hoped to win the election. Didn't happen, but it was a good shot. As a young city, Chicago had a wide range of political opinions. People came from all over to make their money, to give it their best shot. They knew, this political class knew that Douglas was politically powerful and would win the state if the wrong man was running. As a vital swing state, Illinois rather, needed a man who was a moderate, who could win the election. Not someone like Seward, who, though famous for his abolitionist stances, was not known as a compromising man, was not accepted in the South. They needed someone who they thought could forestall the Civil War. Lincoln was uncertain about running for president. He thought he would be a better vice president than chief executor. However, the Chicago-based political class knew the quality of their man. They wanted him to run for office, the highest office. And so they pushed him and pushed him and pushed him, saying that if it didn't work out, then you could go for vice president. Eventually convinced, the Lincoln men then plotted to trick the rest of the National Convention into nominating Chicago as the location for the convention. This was done because Lincoln was popular in Chicago. No one knew his name nationally. He was a one-time congressman. He'd given some speeches. He had a reputation as being a loser, having lost the Senate race. No one considered him a opponent to their own candidacy. So they agreed on Chicago, thinking he was not an obstacle. But Lincoln was very popular in Chicago. The cabal of political friends of his pulled various hijinks, such as printing false tickets, stacking the deck, and rigging the seating chart, in order to gain control and win the nomination for their man. I won't get into all of those hijinks. Now, all of this I learned over the course of a very long writing process. I was brought in for a couple of years to finish a man's life's work. He had worked for years and years to try and place down the memory of Lincoln and his home city, Chicago. He had notes and notes and notes, and his whole apartment was full of books on Abraham Lincoln. He had stuffed every corner. And yet, in all his notes, he could not find the time or the energy to write this down. So I was brought on to take all his notes, all those boxes and boxes, figure out where he'd gotten his information, and write that down. It was sometimes a slow process, sometimes a frustrating process, but we managed to write down everything we could find about Abraham Lincoln and the city of Chicago and put it into one book, though doubtless we are missing some pieces of information here and there. The writing process is a collaborative one, even when writing on your own, because you need feedback for, to get not just the information down, but like the sentences, even the periods and the commas. Writing the story on its own was no good. You needed a second set of eyes, you needed feedback. And so together we wrote and wrote and wrote, and then finally managed to put together this book. It was funny, sometimes he would be just watching TV and he'd come across an NBC show or something like that and someone would toss out another little nugget of Lincoln history or something that had happened in the city. And we would go chasing that nugget. We would run and read everything we possibly could to try and find where that was and how it could connect to our story. History is a tricky thing. It can be found all over, but it's hard to know what you're looking for. It's hard to know what is connected to the story you're trying to tell and what is tangential, what shoots off of it. I can remember writing down a list of all the hotels in Western Illinois that Abraham Lincoln visited at one time or another, and quite a few of them are written down in this book. It can be a hard thing to find the things you're looking for. And it's a hard thing to know why it's important. There are a lot of useless stories for the story you're trying to tell to get nailed down, to put into your story. The publishing process was quite its own nightmare. We were writing, or we started looking for a publisher in the heart of the pandemic. This was at a time when there were paper shortages because people were hoarding toilet paper. And so there weren't enough pages going into books. No one was printing as many books. And we got this feedback that none of the publishers were taking new manuscripts at the time because they just couldn't find the paper. And this was just sort of another thing we had to deal with. We had to manage to sell our book at a time when nothing was getting sold. We had to manage to find someone who was willing to work with us to get this story told. The publisher-writer relationship is tricky. It can be hard to find someone who wants your story, who wants to tell your story. Sorry. But doubtless there are stories to be told by everyone. Everyone has experienced some aspect of history, some angle of history, and all those stories are easily lost over time. And that is something that my writing partner felt very strongly about. He felt he was finding all these references to Lincoln and Chicago, and yet no one had taken the time or the effort to write down those stories in their own place. History can get lost in the pages. There are too many stories for us all to remember. And finding the story you want to tell is simple, but finding the materials you need for it is very challenging. We combed through books that were from Lincoln's time, and we combed through books that were from before Lincoln's time. We were looking for any connection, any reason why this young city and this young politician would join forces and take their ideals national. The relationship between this president, our most famous president, and this young city was a close one. It was an important one, because though Chicago made many contributions to the Civil War, both in men and material, the greatest contribution it made was vaulting the man who would guide the Union through the war into his place where he could do it. Our relationship to politicians is very different in this age than it was in Lincoln's. We have more access to them, and they have a lot more access to us, whether we want that access or not. But we still have things we can learn from that connection, the story of Lincoln and his relationship with Chicago. We can learn that people, be they a small cabal of political movers and shakers, newspaper moguls, a boisterous mayor, and the people on the street who filled the wigwam where Abraham Lincoln was elected, or nominated rather, who filled it to the brim and shouted only when Abraham Lincoln's name was mentioned. Chicago delivered Illinois to Lincoln, the vital swing state in the vital election. Lincoln received no votes south of, or rather, won no counties south of Springfield. It was Chicago that delivered Illinois to Lincoln and to the Republican Party as it took the election of 1860. Lincoln's personal relationships helped to do this. And as we searched through the memoirs of men like Medill, we found sometimes a warm relationship, sometimes a very cold one. Medill seemed very upset at how Lincoln never thought of himself as nationally viable and would go off of him every once in a while, preferring Salmon Chase of Ohio to be the president. But when push came to shove, it was these relationships between these men that held. Medill, for example, chose Chicago because he knew no one would think it. Everyone thought it was neutral territory, but it wasn't. Medill rigged the seating plan so that all the swing states in the nomination would be sat next to the Lincoln men, and all the ones they couldn't trust were sat next to Seward's delegation, which meant that the Lincoln men could keep an eye every time the Seward men came over and tried to talk to one of the swing states. You got to watch out for the secretaries. That's where they get you. This story was the story chosen by a man that I had never met before. He had spent his whole life writing it, researching it, rewriting it, rewriting it, rewriting it, rewriting it. He had dozens and dozens of copies of notes just on one issue, on one topic, and it was filling his life. He wanted this story done so that all that work could finally see the light. History is a funny thing. I'm sure every one of us has a different memory of the things that have happened and the reasons why they happened. And there are few definitive answers. But there is a lot to be remembered and put out there just so that you can form your own opinions and your own ideas of what should happen or should have happened, why it happened. And there are lots of aspects to great stories that no one remembers or that they skim over, and there's a lot to delve into it. We have lost more about the human race than we will ever remember. 5,000 years of written records and very little remembered about the daily life. Abraham Lincoln once sat in a bathtub big enough for him and wrote it down as a memorable occurrence in his life. That sort of thing is not considered great history. It is not. It's not in the definitive biographies of the man, and yet it shows us that this was a person living his life who found his way and found himself standing at the forefront of our nation, trying to hold together all the pieces that were trying to pull themselves apart. History is about people. That's all it's about. There are great movements, movers and shakers, things that shatter our world and things that put it all back together. But at the end of the day, it's all just people. People trying to live their lives. People trying to fix something that they feel is wrong. People doing their best to get through another day. In writing this book and in getting it published after quite some time of trying to find paper, we have tried to tell the story of a man and a city. A man who was quite unsure of himself very often, who never knew the proper course of action to take, but who found himself the favorite of an entire political class, of an entire general population, who found himself leading our country through its darkest hour, even as doing so killed him. I think I'm there. I am happy to take any questions you might have about Lincoln. Chicago at the time of Abraham Lincoln, about the writing process, about the publishing process. Yeah.
We'll have some questions later, but there may be some portions of the book that you could read to us.
Oh, sure.
I had my favorite about his legal fees, the $5,000.
Oh, okay. I will pick that out for you. If I can find the page. Here we go. In January 1865, Lincoln argued the case of the Illinois Central Railroad before the state Supreme Court. He had started working for them in 1853 and would be lead counsel on a total of 11 cases. McLean County wanted to tax the company's property, but the charter given by the state had exempted the company from tax in return for a percentage of its profits. It was the third time this particular case had been heard in court. Opposing counsel was John Stewart and Stephen Logan, both Lincoln's former law partners. In this third trial, the verdict was unanimous and in the company's favor. He presented the company with a bill of an unheard of $5,000. Though legal bills of that size were not uncommon in New York, it was the largest legal bill yet submitted in frontier states. Illinois Central was in a tough position. The fee was exorbitant, but Lincoln's services were indispensable. So the company presented a compromise. Lincoln sued them, submitting the opinion of 7 lawyers, each stating that the $5,000 was fair for the work he had done. The Illinois Central Railroad sent no representative. The verdict was given to Lincoln by default. Among the 7 lawyers was Stephen Logan, who had just lost to him in this very case, and Norman Judd, along with 2 other lawyers from Chicago. Lincoln received the $4,800 that was still unpaid after the retainer. This was the largest paycheck that he ever received prior to becoming president. Unsure of whether or not he still worked for Illinois Central due to his suit against them, Lincoln went to their office in Chicago in early 1857. The company happily kept him on, giving him legal cases while he sued them. In Chicago, he sat for his first photograph with Alexander Hessler, a Chicago-based photographer whose photos track Lincoln's rise to prominence. Lincoln had photos of himself taken frequently, more so than most people of the day. This was not vanity. The abundance of pictures were of political use, helpful for publicity, so that supporters knew his face and felt an attachment to him. Abraham certainly did not think of himself as handsome. When an opponent called him two-faced, he responded, "If I had 2 faces, why would I wear this one?" Later, when he was president, an official tendered his resignation, and Abraham replied, "All right, Addison, I accept your resignation, but nothing can compensate me for the loss of you. For when you retire, I will be the ugliest man left in the employ of the government." His oft self-deprecating humor helped set people at ease and make them feel in on the joke. Though no record can say what Addison thought of it. On the last day of Lincoln's Day, he was invited to give a speech at the Metropolitan Hall on the corner of LaSalle and Randolph Streets. Here, Republicans were deciding their ticket for local elections. It was one of the few occasions when Lincoln gave an unscheduled speech. Normally, when he came to Chicago to work, there was always someone who wanted him to speak on one topic or another. Unscheduled speeches were an unwelcome distraction he tried to avoid. When working on an important case, he would avoid the Tremont because it was too easy for the crowds to find him there. At these times, he would stay in the homes of friends. But since this visit was not for a case, he gladly gave a speech. The Chicago Republicans were split over supporting John Wentworth. Lincoln urged them to hold true to their party and avoid factionalism. By securing Chicago for the Republicans, they could secure the state. He was cheered on by an adoring crowd. Support for Lincoln was stronger than ever in Chicago. This sentiment was aided in no small part by Joseph Medill and his newspaper. Some of you may know that John Wentworth was one of our mayors. He was a particularly divisive figure as he burned down the red light district personally. He went on a raid and cleared out the red light district, accidentally starting a fire. But these were the sort of men that were in and around Abraham Lincoln. They weren't necessarily shining and clean the way Lincoln is often remembered as, but they could afford to get their hands dirty as they were not under the same political pressures that Abraham Lincoln was. They could afford to pull hijinks and lock opponents' supporters out of the building and hide their supporters and squirrel them away into some corner of a building. Chicago is an important place for the Lincoln legacy, and not one that we often think about. The Great Chicago Fire, for example, burned down a huge swath of the city. It also burned down Robert Lincoln's law office and many personal letters that he kept from his father. Robert Lincoln managed to make it to his office while the fire was raging, but he saved some personal effects and not the letters from his father. So as much has been lost in this city as has been preserved and remembered.
I think there's time for another section.
Sure. I'll read a section on the funeral held in Chicago. Abraham Lincoln had the longest and perhaps largest funeral in history, as he was mourned in city after city as the train went from Washington back to Springfield. He rapidly decayed in front of the eyes of mourners and had to be mummified in order to let people view him. In all, 7 million people viewed the body, the procession of the train, or the train go by. Teddy Roosevelt watched the New York funeral from his grandfather's apartment. James Buchanan, who had left so much of the succession crisis to Lincoln, watched the train pass in Pennsylvania. After the stop in New York, it was decided they would no longer show his face as the decomposition was so advanced. The lid was shut, but the mourning crowds would not have it, demanding to see him. So instead, a mortician made sure Lincoln was presentable to the public before the public was permitted to see him. As the train wound its way home, his skin turned black, his body shriveled. With white chalk, they tried to hide the decay. Even so, it was noticeable to the mourners. By the end of his journey, his 6'4" frame, which had only just fit inside the coffin at the beginning, had room to spare. Where Washington was the grandest, New York the largest, Chicago was the most heartfelt. The city had given much to the Union cause during the war. Land, money, and blood all sacrificed at the altar of the nation. As the train arrived in Chicago, it waited on a trestle above Lake Michigan. A platform was built over the lake, and the coffin was taken off the train. The pallbearers were all close friends, Wentworth among them. Beneath a magnificent Gothic triple arch just off the beach in what is now Dearborn Park, near where Buckingham Fountain is today, the city said its farewell. He was eulogized by Chicago politicians, just as he had given eulogies for Zachary Taylor and Henry Clay. 36 maidens in white walked beside the coffin, each placing a single flower upon it. Everything was draped in finery, so that the city was colored black, red, white, and blue. Slowly, he was moved in a procession down Michigan Avenue, then down Lake Street, avoiding run-down or industrial areas until the procession came to the courthouse in which he had argued so frequently and successfully. There, the casket was opened, and the people of Chicago filed past, eager for one last glimpse of their hero. It was 2 weeks since he had been shot, and his body was in a state of distressing decay. Many wept at the sight of his shriveled frame. For 2 days, the solemn line shuffled past him, even through the night. Over 100,000 people paid their respects. Many had known him in life. At last, it was time to go home, a peaceful last ride from Chicago to Springfield on the train line he had lobbied for himself. Lincoln left Chicago for the last time, but the people of Chicago did not permit him to take this tragic journey without one final gift. George Pullman, having made a fortune in Chicago raising buildings to accommodate new sewers, had since entered into train manufacturing. He had built the most luxurious train cars, the first sleeper cars with washing and dining facilities, with shocks to ease a ride. Perfect for the golden age of rail. The Pullman sleeper car was wider than most others, and platforms had to be moved in advance to accommodate it. Lincoln was placed in one such car, built in Chicago, for the journey from Washington to Springfield. The car had only just been delivered to the president, meant to allow him and his cabinet to travel the country comfortably and safely. It was never used in Lincoln's life. Its first use was taking the slain president along the journey home.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
So we'll have a musical interlude now, and followed by a question and answer period. This is the time we ask if you're able to make contributions to the society. These contributions help make programs like this possible, and we suggest a $5 donation, but whatever you can give, there's a basket in the back. You can also do this through Venmo, online at ethicalhuman.org. So with the music. This is our time for questions to our speaker, Michael. We invite you to come to the podium, to the microphone there to ask your questions. People that are online can submit questions, and I'll take them during this portion. Do ask questions, make them brief as a courtesy to other people who may have, who want to ask. And with that, please come.
I'm sorry if I missed the introduction, but how did you come to write this book? You had not previously read.
I had
Wrote a
not.
book
I
and-
was. I found a job posting on a job board, and yeah, it was kind of bizarre, but I met with the man, interviewed with him, and then we talked about the project and what he wanted, and then I was writing the book for him.
Who was he?
He was a florist who spent his whole life trying to write the history of Lincoln and Chicago. It was just a passion project of his. Yeah.
And he didn't have experience writing. Why did he post a job, an ad?
Well,
wanted it?
he wanted this finished. He had stacks of notes, endless reams of notes. And his whole apartment was full of Lincoln books, but he couldn't do the writing himself. So he hired me to come in and write the project for him.
And you hadn't written a book before.
No, I was just out of college. Yeah.
Okay. And how did you get it published?
We wrote a book proposal. So when you want a book published, you have to fill out sort of a long questionnaire that publishers want. They want to know what's the book about, length, what other books are in the market that sort of fit that that outlook. And you write the book proposal, and you submit it to agents and publishers, and a lot of the time you don't hear back. You just got to keep going and ping the publishers and agents until you do hear back. And
So how did that go? Did you get it published promptly, or you had to go through many?
we took a long
attempts?
time because we were publishing it at the height of we were looking for a publisher in the height of the pandemic, and there was no paper, and people just weren't accepting new projects because they couldn't print them. So yeah, this took us a long time before we found a publisher.
How long?
I would say probably a full year of reaching out and trying to get someone to answer us.
And who did publish it?
We are published with History Press, which is an imprint of Arcadia Press.
And what's
And so they do local books. So they're not the big New York companies, but they do local books across the United States.
and what's happened with the book? Have you been selling them?
So the book is actually in most bookstores in Illinois. So what they'll do is they will they'll buy a regional book, and they'll put in all the regional bookstores they can. So yeah, it's in bookstores and available online. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've heard that Lincoln had a fairly weak speaking voice, and before the days of electronics like I'm using right now, how did speaking work back then?
For the Lincoln-Douglas debates, raised platform, and they just sort of tried to shout as loud as they could, get heard in the back. People were quiet. They wanted to hear. But there were, people would gather up all around you and listen as you spoke. The crowds weren't typically enormous. We're not talking 70,000 people or anything, but a couple thousand, couple hundred, and people just had to press in close and listen up. and the speeches went for a long time. The main speaker of the Gettysburg at the Gettysburg service was not Lincoln, but was another man, and he spoke for 2 hours. The Lincoln-Douglas debates went 1 hour. First speaker got 1 hour, second speaker got an hour and a half, the first speaker got a rejoining 30 minutes. So these were long events. And everyone was wearing starched suits. Yeah, it was pretty rough.
You spoke quite a bit about many people's preference for Seward, I think, as you were mentioning, over Lincoln, and the fact that Seward was a stronger abolitionist, and I guess Lincoln was sort of the compromise.
Yeah.
And I guess the entire 1850s had been spent with everybody trying to compromise their way out of a civil war. I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, and also the fact that, I mean, Lincoln's eventual election seemed to directly trigger the Civil War anyway.
Yeah. Well, so Seward was a famous senator. He had been in the Senate for ages. He was talked about. He was one of the first people to join this new Republican Party when people were unsure. He was outspoken as an abolitionist, world famous. He was sort of the guy you would pick to put in your cabinet. He was the obvious choice. He was politically powerful. He had a slick machine. In the book, we write about how wavering candidates at the nomination were treated to champagne and oysters in Chicago. They managed to get oysters there. He had everything going for him, except that he was a hardliner, and people thought if he's elected, people thought he couldn't get elected, or at least that was the Chicago position. The Chicago position was this guy, he could win Ohio, but he can't win the swing states. He can't win Illinois. He can't win the ones we need to win. So everyone at the nominating convention was trying to angle themselves to be the anti-Seward candidate. They wanted to be the one that the whole voting bloc was divided, and they wanted to be the one that people would coalesce under. And, well, everyone else just didn't have the team that Lincoln had. Lincoln had, he had some real crooks on his team willing to pull any trick. But yeah, people didn't want war to tear the nation apart. People were trying very hard. I believe there's a Lincoln quote which said, "If I could preserve the Union without freeing any slaves, I'd do it. If I could preserve the Union by freeing some slaves and leaving others in bondage, I would do it." People were very concerned about this coming violence. And in the end, it was just, I think, fear that Lincoln would come in and change this entire way of life that drove people. And there was, people convinced themselves that they could win the war in the South and in the North. They were certain that they could win it, so they tried, and eventually it all just fell apart.
One quick little follow-up. Lincoln put Seward in his cabinet.
Yep.
Was there any problem or friction or anything doing that?
Well, so a lot of Lincoln's first cabinet were political rivals. And the reason for this was because at the nominating convention, this was before civil service reform. The way it was expected to happen was you were elected, and then you gave out goodies to all your supporters. And cabinet positions were pretty powerful goodie bags. And so at the convention, Lincoln wanted no deals made. He didn't want to be bound going into his presidency. Lincoln's men made all the deals they could make. They sold cabinet positions for votes and ended up selling, I believe, 4 before Lincoln had made it. And then, after the convention, Lincoln tried to heal the rift of his nomination, heal the pro-Stewards and the anti-Stewards together. And to do that, he put Seward in the most important position in the cabinet, which is Secretary of State. That before the vice presidency became like a big deal. Secretary of State was the president's most important advisor, so he gave that out to his perhaps biggest rival in order to heal the factionalism, and Seward was good at his job, so it worked out.
Yeah, we got Alaska.
Yeah.
So, Michael, I have a question. You said there were lots of material there. What did you have to leave out, and what was the thing you most remembered and regretted having to leave out?
So he had a lot of stories about Lincoln in Chicago, but he was also hunting down interesting Lincoln stories, things that happened to him throughout the country. And a lot of that we had to parse down because we just had to focus on his relationship with a few Chicago moguls and businessmen and with the city itself. So we couldn't write down everything he was running around and doing. But also this book is about half of what we wrote, because the story continues with Robert Lincoln and Mary Lincoln, who lived in Chicago for a time and worked to preserve the Lincoln legacy while living in Chicago. But that was too much to put into the book at this time. So there was quite a lot that we left out. Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that there wasn't direct election of United States senators.
Right.
So actually, that was still controlled by the legislatures.
So
and
it's done by the state legislature who picks the guys. And so while the Lincoln-Douglas Senate race of 1858 was very successful for Lincoln, I believe Lincoln got more votes. The legislature decided for Douglas because that's just how the state was drawn up at the time. Yeah.
I just remember, too, a lot of elections, local, national, would have been a lot different if women could have voted.
Mm-hmm.
Indians, and it's really not pointed out in much history. Lincoln and Douglas had relationships going back into the legislature, back to the 1840s. Was there anything in the notes about that? And
They were
went a
personal.
little bit deeper between those two?
Yeah, so that's in our book. They were personal friends. Odd as it may sound, I mean, they're famous rivals, but they were personal friends. Douglas actually courted Mary Todd when she first came to Springfield. They got along. So back in those days, after legislature was out, once everyone was done with their legal practice for the day, they would gather up and Lincoln would just tell stories to everyone. And Douglas was there a lot of the time, just listening to the stories told. During the election of 1860, once it became clear to Douglas that he wasn't going to win, he actually he went south and stopped stumping for himself and started campaigning for Union. He said, no more, Lincoln's not going to destroy your way of life. Don't secede. Don't do this. And at his first swearing in, Lincoln took off his hat to read the oath of office, but he couldn't find a place to put his hat. Stephen Douglas was there and held his hat throughout the entire swearing-in ceremony, happily. Yeah, and then almost immediately after that, Douglas dies of a disease. It just hits him. So he may have played a larger role in the Lincoln administration had he not just died.
Okay, I had two questions. The first was, I just wanted to clarify, did you say that Lincoln said that if he could keep the Union together, even without freeing slaves, he would do that, or freeing some slaves, he would be willing to do that? That's my first question. I just wanted to clarify.
So he said, yes, he did say early on that his primary goal was to preserve the Union. He said if he could if he could do it by freeing all the slaves, he would do it by freeing all the slaves. If he could do it by freeing some of them, he'd do it by some of them. And if he could do it by freeing none of them, he would do it by none of them. And as the war progressed, it became both politically expedient and sort of vital to link the cause of the Union to the cause of abolition. It gave, another reason to fight the war and allowed them to deliver devastating blows to the Southern economy by freeing the slaves.
So I was just curious, do you have any idea, like, what percentage of the people in the Union were abolitionists or opposed to slavery? Because you're saying that helped foster the war effort. How did?
I don't know what percentage. Abolitionism was certainly a popular opinion in the North, but by tying it with abolition, it gave a more concrete reason to fight rather than just the sort of esoteric preserve the Union. By turning it into a war to end slavery, something that people thought was morally wrong in the North, that gave them, an additional reason to fight. And it also kept foreign powers out of the war. British mills and textile factories worked with Southern cotton, and that dried up when the war started. Britain was considering perhaps recognizing the Confederacy or giving aid, and by making the war about slavery, something that the United Kingdom had already outlawed, it made it so that the United Kingdom did not intervene, and the same with France, yeah.
Okay, and then I was just curious, and I missed the very beginning of your speech, so forgive me. I was just wondering how you got inspired to write this, and how you think what might help other people to get inspired to tell their own stories, because I know you were talking about everybody has a slice of their own history.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I think if you're looking for a way to start writing, the only way to do it is just to sit down and write a little bit every day. You might not know the full story you're trying to tell. You might not know all the details, all the ins and outs, but even just like sitting down and writing a plan or writing the outline or something like that, just doing a little bit every day will get the project going, and that's the important part. Mm-hmm. Once it's going somewhere. But also, it'll open up new avenues, and you'll see, oh, I can go over here and write about this facet that I hadn't been thinking about, or that's not working out. I'll stop going off that tangent and bring the story back. Inspiration's a tricky thing. One moment of inspiration will never write a whole book. You have to sit down and do it every day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit more about your co-author, John Tomer. You were telling me about it before, and it's a bit of a sad story, but go ahead and share it.
So I actually met John Toman sort of at the end of his life. He passed on after we got this book to a publisher, but before the book physically came out in bookstores. This was a life goal of his, and he saw it through to the end. He had worked on this project for 20 years before I ever came in. But it was the goal of a lifetime, and though it was really hard for him, he did get it finished. And he had a copy of the book when he passed. Yeah. you.
It's good to have you here. So, let's see, we have announcements now about society activity. So, on Monday, we have our film discussion group, Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin and Winter's Bone. That looks like Jennifer Lawrence. And you can go to the email office at ethicalhuman.org for the link. That discussion is virtual. And on the 16th, next week, we'll have Nina Patel here to talk about Between the Silence, Creating Connection with Small Acts of Kindness. And 23rd is a community day where we come here for discussion. The essence of being, critical reflections on conscious existence. Any other announcements? No?
Yes, it seems that,
I do have books available if you are interested.
Okay.
there's a very minimal amount of refreshments, as is usual in our chaotic situation right now.
In the future, if you have announcements that are not society-related, please consider sending an email via the community listserv. So, any newcomers here, please, if you're interested, sign a membership card at the desk if you haven't done so already. If you have questions about the society with our members here, I'll be glad to talk to you. So, a couple closing remarks. When he was asked once to define his religious beliefs, Lincoln quoted an old man he had heard say, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. And that's my religion." And in this age of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, let us remember these words which have been attributed to Lincoln, but not conclusively proven to be Lincoln, to be clear. And that is, you can fool some of the people some of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Thank you all for coming, and please enjoy some refreshments and have a chance to talk to Michael. Thank you. See you around.